My next assertion is that Jesus never claimed to be God.
What's up, YouTube? Today we actually have a video of myself and Alex O'Connor debating whether or not Jesus claimed to be God on the recent Jubilee video, 1 atheist versus 25 Christians. What an experience. Let's check it out. There's me. It's so fast. So I'm actually the very first person to go.
Where does Jesus claim to be God?
Yeah, so I'm curious, when you say that, are you including the book of John?
So I think that the book of John is probably the least historically reliable in this case. So I'm talking about the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
I do think that there are a number of instances where Jesus appears to claim to be God in John's gospel.
Okay.
But even if we think that he actually said that, I still think that there's reason to believe that he wasn't claiming to be God in the sense of being identical with Yahweh.
When you talk about the historical Jesus, what else do you pull from other than the gospels of things that he might have said?
The things that he might have said, we only...
So I asked that question because there's this idea of the historical Jesus, right? As if he somehow exists outside of the Gospels. Now, Alex is trying to make a case that there's some other resources that the Gospels pull from. So he mentioned them, Q, and then there's some other source. I'm not saying that that's not true, but what he's trying to argue is that the more people say Jesus said something, the more likely it is to be true, which I'm totally fine with that. But I do think it's a disservice to completely dismiss John's gospel when it's considered widely as one of the four sources of Jesus's life. So that's why I asked, are you pulling from anywhere else other than the gospels to try to make up who you think, not like literally make up, but try to discover who you think Jesus is?
only really have the Gospels, but there are multiple sources within the Gospels.
What do you date it at?
Around 70 AD.
Okay, yeah.
I sort of go with the scholarly consensus. And so you have also a bunch of sources, the unique sources to Matthew and Luke.
Yeah.
You also have this potential source called Q from the German for quail, right? All of this kind of stuff. John comes in the latest.
Sure.
And so when we're trying to figure out what the historical Jesus actually said, if we've got multiple sources all claiming that he said the same thing, then I think we have good reason to think that he actually said that. Claims like, before Abraham was, I am, I and the Father are one, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father, only appear in the Gospel of John, not in any of our other sources, which I think makes them less historically reliable.
Here's the thing. You can completely take that view and you can completely dismiss the book of John. Completely just throw it out. And Jesus is still both pictured by the gospel writers to be divine, and Alex is actually going to acknowledge that in this conversation, and Jesus both makes claims of divinity in the other gospels. Now, he wants to say even to try to separate it from Yahweh. I don't buy that, and I'll give my best example later on, but let's continue.
Well, I like the claim. I got to come at it a little bit different approach because I think that the gospel writers are claiming that Jesus is God. Sure. Let's just go with Mark. As Mark starts, he talks about John the Baptist preparing the way for the Lord. Right? What is your response for that? Because ensuing Jesus comes.
I've no problem saying that Mark is intending to portray Jesus as God. It's not entirely clear, but I have no problem just granting that for the sake of this conversation. I think that the belief that Jesus is God is something that developed in early Christianity after Jesus died. I think there's nothing that Jesus said himself.
See, I'm really glad that he said that, because the idea is that it's kind of trickled out between, like, from Mark all the way out into John. That's kind of the initial argument that gets presented. And because he said that, I'm going to take it back even earlier to the writings of Paul.
That can make us confidently say that he was walking around claiming to be God.
What do you need in order to believe that Jesus is God? Because even if we take kind of this development in the Gospels, we can go before that. So would you say Paul's letters like Philippians and Colossians, would you say they were written before the Gospels?
Yes, they were written before the Gospels.
So if we're going before the Gospels, we have Paul claiming that Jesus is God in Philippians 2, where he's saying was in the form of God, or maybe like a better translation would even be the essence or the nature of God.
Yeah, the problem I think with sort of quote mining in this respect is that there are quotes that point us in either direction, even in the Gospel of John. So Paul, for example, says that there is one God, which is the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, seeming to separate them. Jesus says things like, my Father is...
That's not an issue biblically, just to point out. Rarely is the Father called the Lord in the New Testament. It only happens like a handful of times where the Father is called Lord, okay? Because that's a title that's typically reserved for Jesus in the New Testament. And in the same sense, rarely is Jesus called God. Yeah. In the New Testament, because that's typically what the Father, the title for the Father is. You catch what I'm saying? They're both titles, God and Lord. And typically, the Father is referred to as God, Jesus is referred to as Lord, but they're actually interchanged within the New Testament. Just wanted to point that out.
Is greater than I am. He says things like, nobody knows the hour, not even the Son knows the hour, but only my Father in heaven. He says when he's crucified in the first two Gospels, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? I could point to these and say, these are Jesus claiming that he's separate from God.
Well, there is a distinction from the Father and the Son. So
Sure.
Yeah.
we're not, but instead of quote mining, I could just quote the whole thing. That though he was in the form of God, didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men.
Sure. So I also have no problem saying that Paul thought that Jesus was God.
I'm really glad he said that. And the reason why I was quoting it was to actually keep going. He cut me off because I wasn't quote mining Philippians 2 by just grabbing a verse. Philippians 2, 1 through 11, specifically 4 through 11, if you get through the whole passage, he was in the form of God, but did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, emptied himself, he dies on a cross. At the end, it says, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that everyone would worship him to the glory of God the Father. And he had already made a distinction that he doesn't believe that Jesus is Yahweh, yet Paul is making the connection that Jesus has the name above every name, which is referred to as the Lord in the Old Testament, Yahweh. So I was going to quote the whole thing because he accused, or not accused, but he called it quote mine. But I think Philippians 4 through 11 is a passage that significantly claims that Jesus is God, but then he grants it. So I appreciate that. Okay. But think about where we're at in the conversation now. Okay. He dismisses John, which is whatever, but then grants that the Gospels acknowledge that Jesus is God, the Gospel writers, or at least divine. And then he acknowledges that Paul thinks that Jesus is God. Just kind of noting that. Really interesting where we've made it in this conversation.
Okay,
my
so
assertion is that Jesus
that's actually
claims to be
super
God.
clarifying for me, because then my question is, what piece of evidence do you now need in order to believe that Jesus claimed to be God? Like, what is it for you that you would be like, you know what, that convinces me?
Jesus, in his own words, saying that I am God.
Right, but he does that in John.
Where?
Before Abraham was, I am.
Sure.
So I do appreciate him saying that, right? Jesus himself. For the sake of time, I went back to John. Okay. And he's already dismissed John. And so was that the best move? No, but like you only have so much time in this, right? Like if you look at this photo right now, I've got 9 flags up. So if I'm going to make my point, I've got to get there the quickest to just go, hey, this is a very clear spot where Jesus claims that he's God. However, I think one of the most clear spots in the whole New Testament, and then even in the Gospels where Jesus claims to be God is Mark chapter 14. If I had more time, and I think Than, the guy in the Hawaiian shirt, you can see him in the back, he's going to go there if I remember correctly. Actually, I haven't watched the full thing yet because I'm watching with some friends later. But because Jesus says that he is the one in Matthew 14 in the 60s, I can't remember, that is going to sit on the throne of God, and he rides on the clouds, which is very significant. One, because he's sitting on the throne of God at the right hand of power, but the idea of Jesus riding on the clouds is significant in 2 ways. And that one, he's clearly pointing out that he is the Son of Man in Daniel 7. But 2, he's doing something that only Yahweh does in the Old Testament, in riding on the clouds. And then if you read the response in the very passage, the high priest actually claims that it's blasphemy. Why? Not because he's claiming to be the Messiah, but that he's claiming to be God. And so it's tough because he said that he would believe that Jesus was God if Jesus said it. And then he dismisses the places where Jesus actually says it. That's where I got him. And that's where we're at in the conversation. And it's about to end.
Before Abraham was, I am. For a start, as I've said, it only appears in the Gospel of John. We don't know if the
But he
historical
at least
Jesus
said it
it.
once, and the
But
claim
if
is that he never did.
If he
Got him.
actually said that, if he was going around claiming to be God in explicit terms,
That's a great.
why
yeah.
is it that none of the other Gospel writers thought it was a relevant detail to mention?
It's difficult to now deal with it because you are acknowledging.
Okay, pause. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
You've
no,
been
that's
voted
great.
out by
Hey,
the majority.
okay,
Great to meet you too.
So that's the nature of the video on, right? I get voted out, and I got a great 4-minute conversation with him, which was awesome. But I totally understand his argument that he kind of dismisses John, and then the majority of Jesus, things that Jesus said in the Gospels don't claim that Jesus is God. I totally understand that argument. I do want to clarify, though, because I didn't get a chance to obviously do this in that video, where he says that Jesus is explicitly going around claiming to be God. And the idea is that he does that in John, and he's not doing that in the Synoptics. I don't think that he's actually doing that in either one. I think John 8:58 is a very rare moment that Jesus mostly is both implicitly claiming to be both the Messiah, the Son of God, and God himself. They're much more implicit claims, which makes a lot of sense in the moment, right? If anyone's just going around saying that they're God, nobody would believe them. But he implicitly says it in multiple places, and then he does things to show that he really is. He basically has authority over demons, sickness, the weather, death itself, right? And what happened is post-resurrection, in hindsight, his disciples were able to go back and fully understand who he is, which I think just makes a lot of sense that this is how he would have to go about this in revealing himself, right? Because anyone that just goes around explicitly saying that they're God, I'd write him off as a lunatic. But instead, Jesus goes around implicitly saying it, only in a few moments, acknowledging it explicitly, right? And that implicitly it's happening all around, which is why it's very reasonable to see post-death resurrection that Jesus truly is claiming to be God. But overall, great experience. Alex is a great guy. We went to dinner with him afterwards, hung out for several hours. He ended up sitting right across the table from me. So we talked a lot. I really enjoyed the experience. And I encourage you to go check out the full Jubilee video on their channel. So thanks for checking this out. This won't be super edited. I kind of just want to do a live commentary, just my thoughts. Yeah. Have a good one. Like, subscribe. Come on. That was awesome. Look, Jubilee thought I should come on the show. They reached out to me. They thought I had something good to say. Maybe you do too. I'd love for you to subscribe. Yeah. Thanks. Bye.